Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. There's a certain elegance and beauty to the human mind and its complexity. But that complexity can be confusing and make us all the more vulnerable to suffering. Today's conversation is about how we can more comfortably inhabit the richness of our inner world and how to make our mind a better place to live. Our guest today is Tori Olds, PhD. She is co-founder of Deep Eddy Psychotherapy, a training and therapy center in Austin, Texas that houses over 100 clinicians. She teaches 5 weekly international training groups focused on the integration of experiential approaches to therapy. She has created a number of online courses for therapists and loves translating complex psychological concepts to the general public, which she does largely through her YouTube channel, and which I'm sure she's going to do for us today. Tori serves as faculty at the Academy of Therapy Wisdom and as an associate instructor at the Coherence Therapy Institute. She has incorporated spiritual practice into her growth work for 20 years and is a deep lover of the interior world of the human heart and mind. Hello, Tori, and welcome to the Pathways Show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight.
Now, let's just start out by asking you, how did you decide to get into this line of work?
Well, both my parents were psychologists, and not only were they therapists, but they really deeply loved what they did, were passionate about their work, were passionate about learning. So they were always bringing in town, these amazing minds in our field that were inventing forms of therapy and bring them to our home to train Austin therapists, which is where I lived still today. And I just got interested very young. Even in middle school, I was leading little therapy groups for my friends and, doing a lot of depth, therapy in high school and throughout college, et cetera. And then I got, of course, my PhD, but I've known for a long time I wanted to be a psychologist.
And why were you inclined to get a PhD as opposed to an LCSW or something else that would qualify you to take insurance and be a professional counselor?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some, because I'm a big believer that your license doesn't matter, that master's people, just the research shows that it's not about what license you have. On the other hand, there's some advantages to having a PhD. And I knew I was going right in after college. I knew what I wanted to do. It was worth just jumping in and going ahead and doing the whole little extra time, but having the PhD at the end was pretty clear to me, even though I advise people all the time to possibly go for a master's instead of a PhD, because I have lots of students ask me that, which direction to go. But yeah, that was my journey, and it worked out really well.
Now, in our intro, I introduced you as having something to do with bringing experiential therapy into the forefront. What do you mean by experiential therapy?
So there is a whole growing field that I would say is an umbrella term, could be experiential therapy, that is interested in tracking people's moment by moment experience in the room of therapy. So there are therapies that often use a lot of mindfulness, but also somatic tracking, listening, not just mindfulness of emotion, although many of these therapies are emotion focused, but listening to the deeper levels of the mind, what you might call the implicit systems, implicit memory, what we used to call the unconscious mind, the subcortical brain, for knowings, for to speak to us. It's called bottom-up processing, so that we can actually go into the inner mind rather than just try to change it from above. So there's 2 kind of ways in our approach in our field. One's called top-down, and that's like come in with something rational, tell the brain how to behave, and hopefully that trickles down, And then the top-up processing is more like, let's listen to what's just naturally emerging in your whole system, in your whole mind. If we don't try to get in its way, if we just listen to it and learn what's kind of under the hood. And then once we have up in conscious awareness on the table, we can work to make shifts and see what area is needing support, what insight can happen, but not from an analytic perspective, but from really listening internally.
And, listening to the mind can feel pretty chaotic and confusing, and you've said that most people are afraid of their own minds. What do
Yeah.
what do you mean by that?
You know, yeah, I've been recently really thinking about a topic I call psychological empowerment, which is kind of a state where we feel we have clarity toward our own mind. We can understand our internal processes. We feel comfortable in the inner world. Um, and I think the reason that's so needed today is because most of us have had experiences, especially when we were children, but actually lots of types of trauma can cause this as well, where we actually learn to be afraid of, ashamed of, or confused by our own mental processes. So I just
Right.
want to slow down with that thought for a second, because I think most people might resonate with it, but to really slow down and think how actually strange that is. Our brain and mind is meant to be our biggest tool and ally. We wouldn't have evolved to have a brain that was there to mess with us, or make us suffer, or make us make bad choices. Our mind it should be our tool and our ally, but most of us have had some experiences that pit us against our mind, or think, oh no, something internal to me is dangerous. Now, the most common example of that is emotions, but it doesn't have to just be emotions, but I'll give that as an example because it's an easy one. One of the most powerful tools our mind has are emotions. Now, emotions actually are all about empowerment. They're the thing that tell us, hey, intelligent brain, hey, whole system, I think some resource and attention is needed here. Something matters to me. Maybe there's a question I still need to chew on or understand. I got a little confused. I really need to think this through. Or there's a problem that needs to be solved, or I need to do some grief work, which we could have a whole conversation what that is, but it's actual work that's important. Or I need to take action. I just need some focus on this piece. And emotion is simply the cue from the deeper brain that says, intelligent brain, can you put resource here? So emotion is our first step toward wellness, toward taking care of ourselves, toward what I think of as empowerment. But for so many people, we learn to actually fear our emotions because we live in a very emotion phobic world,
Well, don't you think it's true that the emotions are kind of like an old brain? I read something somewhere saying evolution has a design strategy that is simply to build a new capacity on top of the old one. It doesn't, like, if I was in the software business, and if you need it, there's a point where you don't keep patching things. You want to just start over and come up with a more intelligent design that's not doing the old stuff that you don't need to do anymore. And it seems like our emotional selves, or our emotional parts, are still reacting to saber-toothed tigers and threats like that, or everything seems like a threat like that.
In a way, we can be wired that way, but I know I'll try to say two things that sound kind of contradictory. On the one hand, yes, our neocortex is probably the most sophisticated system in some ways.
Right.
But actually, I push a little bit against the idea that our emotional brain, which you could just say everything under our neocortex, is less intelligent. Because actually, what the emotional brain has to do is incredibly sophisticated. It's incredibly sophisticated pattern recognition, basically. Yes, it's not based on logical principles. It's based on old learning. So it can fall into some ruts and be inaccurate, be afraid of things. It doesn't pivot very easily.
Right.
But its job is its capacity to scan the environment and take in new information and compare it to what we saw and experienced in the past, and prepare us for action in really fast ways, is actually brilliant. In some ways, I think it's more impressive than what the neocortex does. But that being said, of course, it needs the neocortex too. It's like they both need each other.
When you talk about psychological empowerment, you describe something that you call a negative frozen stance towards our own inner process. And I think you're alluding to that right now. What do you mean by that? Negative.
Well, actually, yeah, it kind of comes to what we're talking about, that the in some ways because I'm kind of trying to hint at, the emotional brain's actually brilliant. But the second we become afraid of it, it actually can begin to mess with us. We create a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that now we think emotions are all crazy and destructive, but that's because we're approaching them with fear. And when we approach emotions with fear, Fear generally inhibits our neocortex, which is the part we need to actually tame and make sense of and use the raw data that emotion is giving us. So the moment we come to our deeper mind with that sort of fear or shame, we're sort of in this frozen state with our own emotional processes. It actually creates the thing we fear, which is emotions become pointless, overwhelming, etc. But actually, they don't need to be that way. And so that's kind of the pivot that I think psychological empowerment would help us, create. Learning some skills, learning some frameworks that allow us to approach our deeper mind in a way we can actually use the gift it's trying to give us, which is a lot of its own type of intelligence, rather than be afraid of it, which then sort of stagnates the whole process and turns it into chaos.
So you talk about developing a new framework or a new frame for understanding our inner experiences and reactions. And that is counterintuitive to the way therapy has been for so long, which is trying to manage the symptoms from above or through disciplined practices. You say deeper work is possible through being counterintuitive or non-counter interactive.
I'd love to define that real quick. So most forms of therapy were invented with the idea of kind of on a surface level, here's the symptoms. So let's try to counteract them. You're having this behavior, let's teach you to do something else. You're having an irrational thought, let's replace it with you're having an irrational thought, let's replace it with a rational one.
Right.
One of the things the experiential forms of therapy are doing, which I really love, especially one of my mentors, Bruce Ecker, he's the one that coined these terms. He said, instead of being counteractive, which is just taking sort of the way the mind is flowing in the moment and whatever it's learned to do and say, just try to learn this other thing, let's actually be non-counteractive. And just again, like we're talking about that listening space, enter that listening space and try to actually question the mind. What is it that you learned that makes sense of what you're doing or feeling or the patterns that you're in? What did you learn, mind, that necessitates you behave in this way or make sense of why you're having this emotional reaction? Instead of focusing on the emotional reaction or the behavior, what is the learning underneath? What did you experience that taught you, even if that learning is more in the unconscious mind, which it tends to be, that taught you it is imperative to do X, Y, and Z?
Would you say that that's another way of framing what our beliefs?
It is beliefs. It's unconscious beliefs, though.
Right.
So those are a little harder to tap into, but they're scientifically for sure. This is not woo-woo. It's not. I mean, yes, Freud did talk about the unconscious and was the first one, and he was right. But brain science is really showing that so much of what drives our impulses and behaviors and feelings has to do more with implicit memory. So that's a non-conscious process by nature. It means we learn to be and do certain things to protect ourselves. And that learning, just by the nature of reality, not because we're suppressing things, but the nature of how the brain works, lives in less conscious, frameworks. Now, a really obvious example of that is muscle memory. Like if you know how to ride a bicycle, let's say, that's actually pretty sophisticated analysis to learn to ride a bike. Like they had a hard time teaching robots how to stand and do some of the things that our deeper brain figures out. It's actually really complex calculations. That's why I said it's not a dumb part of the brain by any means. So if you're learning to ride a bike, you have a lot of sophisticated, again, calculations happening that allow you to stay upright. But would you be able to put those into words or be conscious of the rules you're learning? Probably not. It's like all sorts of subtle adjustments. You start to tilt this way and you instinctively go the other way to balance, all sorts of things you are doing because it's in muscle memory. Well, we have psychological muscle memory. We have all these things we've learned to do we don't even really remember learning them. It's not it's not in the neocortex. It's not a conscious process, but it's very helpful to staying alive and moving through the world without getting hurt.
And the counteractive approach doesn't really work very well to try to manage and control or through discipline and willpower. I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to stop leaning right, or I'm going to stop, it doesn't really work very well. But you talk about, and this has to do with the fact that our model of the mind has been that there's this unitary self with a single personality that features aspects we want to get rid of or maybe improve on. And that's there's a new thing now. The parts work
Yeah.
is an approach to being non-counteractive to this supposedly unitary mind. Can you describe what that's about?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about parts work because it's become one of the more popular forms of therapy and people might be interested in it. And I'll just really quickly link it to what we were just talking about, which are these unconscious learnings we have.
Right.
Let's just use the bicycle metaphor. Like I have some part of my brain that knows how to use the bicycle, get on a bicycle. But the thing is, we learn all sorts of movements, all sorts of ways of being that are dependent on the context. Maybe with authoritarian, with authority figures, I've learned I have to sort of show up in a certain way to protect myself.
Right.
In a different context, I maybe seem like a different personality because I can be playful or I can do this or that. So we have all sorts of learnings, and they actually exist in parallel, what's called neural networks, but parallel neural firing patterns along the brain. And so when one gets stimulated, it's kind of like opening up a file of learning, like, oh, I know how to do this. I know how to show up with this type of person or in this kind of context or with this part of myself. I know how to do this. When that file of learning opens, it can dictate a lot about how we feel and think and how we show up. But when another file is open, we can kind of seem like a different person almost. We have different, what we think of as facets of our personality. Let's say I'm a boss at work and I am very confident in that domain, and I come home and I'm sort of standing in a certain way and I'm speaking in a certain way and feeling a certain thing in my body, and my wife or husband, looks at me in a kind of shaming way when I walk in the door, and suddenly I feel like I'm 5 years old and I'm, feel so small and I'm stuttering over my speech, that was just an example of these different parts of us. But the thing is, none of those parts, if we can really understand that those are all learned ways in the implicit memory system, learned ways of being or getting our needs met, or most likely protecting ourselves from something, that are just they're learned. They just stay in there like we know how to ride a bike and come up automatically.
I find, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
What I find fascinating is how they can. I like the term subpersonalities. I've been studying IFS, and I know you've done a number of short videos on IFS, internal family systems therapy, on YouTube. And I think it's fascinating to think that these parts can have their own personality. They can have their own beliefs. They can certainly have their own feelings, that might be frozen or not, their own burdens.
Right.
And yet, I know in conventional therapy, a lot of these parts, you might not like the role that they're playing. They're not doing you much good anymore. They've been doing this thing for 40 years and it's not really working for you anymore. And so you're trying to get rid of this part. Whereas in IFS, you don't do that. You basically form a relationship with each of these parts and help it evolve and help it grow up. And that's your internal family. I find that fascinating that you can have different parts with different beliefs and different feelings.
Yeah. We all know this because most of us at the very least have an inner critic. So many people I meet have that particular part, some kind of inner perfectionist or pleaser or critic, or sometimes it's even a bully, that can be quite mean to us. Like, why'd you say that stupid thing? Or tells us we're not good. And that's just, let's use that as an example, because a lot of my clients that come in will say, I know rationally that can't be right. I mean, I believe in everybody's innate goodness. I know we're all trying, but that doesn't mean some part of me is convinced or is trying to convince me that I'm bad, right? So that's a good example of how two different beliefs can happen in one person.
Right.
Right. But the old system used to be, well, let's stand up against your inner bully and tell him to back down. Let's build up self-confidence. Let's convince you you're great. So we can overshadow that other belief. But now the thinking is, what if we honor that belief system, that part, memory system, neural network, however you want to say it, actually learned at some point you were safer if you were hard on yourself. So it learned to do that as a protective maneuver to shame you. And that it's trying its best, and it actually does have your best interest at heart, even if it's an attacking, self-shaming part. It must have learned that was better than not doing that, which there's all sorts of reasons that could be the case.
Right.
And if we go with that assumption, then we can have a respectful relationship with all parts of our mind, all of them, even ones we don't like, even the drinking part or the part that yells at people or feels insecure or is arrogant or whatever. And we can say, tell me how you learned that it was so important to hold that stance. What are you afraid? The IFS question is often, what are you afraid would happen if you let that go? If you stop telling me I was bad, what are you afraid would happen?
Right. And usually it's some vulnerable part would get triggered. That's what it's protecting against, right?
Yeah, often those protecting parts are against some wound, but they could also be around further attack. Like maybe in my family, when you put your head up with pride, you were targeting further abuse. I'll criticize myself and make sure everything's perfect so my very critical dad doesn't catch me in a mistake. Even things like if I convince myself it's my fault, if I take the stance of blaming myself, I
Right.
don't see mom and dad's faults, which is actually important for a kid. It's very scary to see mom and dad's faults because that's very destabilizing and terrifying to think, oh my God, I don't have protection. I don't live under with adults, these humans that actually can take care of me. So as a psychological sanity move, they'll say, okay, at least I feel a little bit better if I blame myself, which is actually adaptive. As horrible as the outcome is of living with chronic shame, like that move might have saved a child's sanity, because they
Right.
would just be too terrified to get that mom and dad actually don't have their stuff together.
And
So yeah,
some of the things I've seen in these IFS videos by various different practitioners, and they model certain therapy sessions, is where you ask the part, how old do you think I am? And
yeah, I love that moment.
and the part says, oh, 5 or 6.
Yeah,
And you go,
yeah,
wait a minute, I'm 60 years old. You've been doing this for me for 40 years. You've been working so hard. Thank you so much. But this isn't really helping me anymore. Maybe there's something else you could do to help me. I found that so constructive as
yeah.
opposed to just trying to kill it off or get rid of it or override it or swamp it with a counteractive maneuver.
I love that you're doing this in your own work. That's so wonderful. And experimenting like, oh yeah, we do have these parts. And it feels just better and more productive if I can just respect them, assume that they're valid, but maybe that they're based on some faulty assumptions. Like, oh no, that part of me still thinks I'm vulnerable and can't stand mom and dad not liking me, or I need to admire them still. Oh wait, actually I don't even live with them anymore. Like, let me help you get the update to a new context where those old rules don't apply, don't need to apply, which actually I think it was a moment of liberation. It's like, oh my God,
I yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
I don't know how many different kinds of therapies use the parts model. I'm only familiar with IFS, and I've been looking into that for the past 6 months. But I've found it interesting that there's a spiritual aspect to it, even though it was
yeah,
founded by Richard Schwartz, who was an atheist.
right,
That there's this thing called the self with a
yeah,
capital S, or you might call it the true self,
right,
and so that's sort of like not a part. And
right.
so what is it? I mean, how would
Yeah,
you?
that's how cool is it that he discovered this organically without having that as like a I
Yeah,
want to, this is my beliefs, I want confirmed. He was just exploring the human mind with
yeah,
all sorts of people. And what he was discovering was like, okay, if we can think of these, I want to say problematic, just because they have a costume, ways of being, like being narcissistic or being insecure, if we can assume they're a part, then we can realize they're not the whole of who you are. They're just a learning. You just learn to be that way.
right.
And as soon as you do that, you can like step back from it a bit. It's like you can get some observing distance between you and that part and not like over identify with it. Oh, I just learned to be insecure because it served me in this context. Okay, now I'm stepping back. Okay, wow, I have this other part. I can step back from that part. And as we begin to what's called unblend, we begin to separate who we are from these learned ways of being, which are not bad, but they're not our true self either. Then it's amazing. It's like digging for the gold. It's like, as you separate the parts out that aren't really your true self, what he saw again and again without intending to, it was surprised him, was finally he would say, okay, well, now what part are we with? And people would say, it's not a part. It doesn't feel like a part. It's just myself. And what he discovered is that self, that human self, invariably was kind, compassionate, had clarity, had confidence, had calm, all these amazing qualities that simply, it's almost like that is the natural state of the human mind. It's just these other ways of being were learned to protect ourselves.
Right.
But the second we separate from them, what we discover is that we have this amazing, and I have to say, it feels a bit spiritual, sort of like higher self that is there just waiting to be discovered.
Definitely. Definitely. I have discovered that, and I love the way that you say, that when we're finally empowered to interface with our inner world with care and effectiveness, which is about having these relationships with our parts, it's a real game changer. And that is so beautiful. And there's so much more that we could explore. I just want to ask you, do you have any words of advice for our audience? Because we only got a little bit of time left.
Well, I guess I would just hold this piece, even if it doesn't quite make sense yet, even if it's just an idea, to begin to consider that there are no bad parts of you. If something seems like a bad part, it's your addict part or your part that can rage at people or whatever, that you could begin to have a relationship with it where you understand, why did it have to do that to protect you? And you can begin to feel that's not ultimately my true self. And you can begin to let your true self take the lead.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Thank you, Tori. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
Thank you for what you do for all of us in the world. And I want to be sure to tell our listeners about your website, which is toriolds.com. That's TORIOLDS.com. And what can they find there?
Well, I have CEU courses for therapists and free videos for clients, although all my free videos are also on my YouTube channel. So that would be the thing to check out if you want to learn more about IFS as well.
Okay, beautiful. Well, for those who may have tuned into Pathways late, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, author of Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. And don't worry, you can play and or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or free podcast servers. And I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with Tori Olds, a psychotherapist and trainer of psychotherapists. And I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every other Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific time. And podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com. That's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes, my YouTube channel, and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien, reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Tori Olds and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.